As president, Maduro faced a series of challenges for which he was neither prepared nor academically trained, including a profound economic crisis characterized by hyperinflation, scarcity of food and medicine, and a general economic contraction due to huge public spending and dwindling tax revenues. Since these economic phenomena were beyond his understanding and he lacked a competent economic team, his government resorted to repeating the typical series of economic measures that make up the Chavista playbook, including currency devaluation, unbacked currency issuance, and implementation of price controls. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Pues si me pones un pelotudo a discutirme que no sabe, me voy.
No sirve eso, Javier.
Y claro, obvio.
The significant difference between Chávez and Maduro as presidents of Venezuela is not just their charisma or lack thereof, but above all the value of Venezuelan oil in the global market and the possibility of extracting resources from PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela Sociedad Anónima, to finance socialism. By firing Chávez's directors and replacing them with loyal yet inept militants, they condemned their source of funding. They killed the goose that laid the golden eggs. The company went from being the third most efficient in the world to one of the most unproductive.
Está despedido también. Muchas gracias por su servicio. Señor Juan Fernández, está despedido de Petróleos de Venezuela. Usted fue hasta el día de hoy gerente funcional de planificación y control de finanzas. Vean ustedes el nivel de esta gente, de una empresa que es de todos los venezolanos. Yo no tengo problema de rasparlos a toditos si a toditos hubiera que rasparlos. No tengo ningún problema. Venezuela afortunadamente tiene recursos humanos que reúnen las dos condiciones, aquellas que mencionaba Bolívar: moral y luces, talento y probidad, y que no están comprometidos con ninguna cúpula offside. Offside. No, están comprometidos con el país serio, con el país que somos y sobre todo con el país que vamos a ser, con el país que podemos ser. Un gran país va a ser Venezuela. Una Venezuela como está dibujada aquí en la Constitución, producto de esta revolución constituyente pacífica y democrática.
Despite the government's attempts to present Maduro as a leader close to the people and promote his image as a simple, hardworking man, the economic reality has had such a negative impact on public perception of his administration that the majority do not want him. The Venezuelan economy depends to a very significant extent on the volume of crude oil production it exports, so any variation in the international price of oil that is not compensated by export volume immediately affects the Venezuelan economy. And the lack of training and the dogmatic belief in distributing resources without taking care of income-generating factors seems to be already a kind of religion that has spread throughout Latin America with a temporary rise in commodity prices. During the same period, 1999 to 2014, the average price of the Venezuelan oil export basket was almost $60 per barrel, a 331% increase over the previous 16 years, and its average production cost only increased comparatively by around 46%. Commodities refer to physical goods that constitute basic components of more complex products. Their main characteristic and advantage is that they have high value, low processing level, and great utility. Simplifying, it's what a country produces without much effort. It can be oil, grains, metals, etc., depending on the place in our rich Latin American geography. When a country's commodities are in high demand in the global market, populist politicians distribute part of the extraordinary income as if it were permanent and thus win electoral support and popularity. But when commodity prices fall again, it reveals that it was not a sustainable model and leads to poverty, which they end up compensating with monetary emission or taking internal and external debt. This happened to most Latin American countries, which instead of taking advantage of the boom to improve infrastructure investments and increase the country's productive capacity, all chose to buy the electorate with unsustainable benefits over time, generating masses of fanatic supporters who end up becoming irrational militants who long for something that cannot be regained. Blind militancy more akin to a religious sect than free citizens demanding sustainable proposals for the country. Clear examples of this were the governments of Venezuela with Chávez, Brazil with Lula da Silva, Bolivia with Evo Morales, Argentina with Néstor Kirchner and Cristina Fernández, Uruguay with Mujica and Tabaré Vázquez. all these politicians sought consecration in a bath of masses that made them feel like heroes at any cost. Populists love marches and mobilizations and invest huge resources and infrastructure in summoning many people to demonstrate to those who are not their followers that they are a majority and feed their followers with a manipulative mystique. The Kirchner marriage in Argentina used to promote large mass demonstrations mobilizing with the entire state structure and the political apparatus of Peronism, showing the rest of society an apparent political majority that finally turned out to be insignificant when the Argentine population truly took to the streets when they won the World Cup and revealed that everything before was not a true reference. On the contrary, it was always a minority mobilized with benefits or money. The supposed masses were a really small proportion of society and a true staging. The economic growth of Latin America during the governments of Lula da Silva in Brazil, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner in Argentina, Evo Morales in Bolivia, and Hugo Chávez in Venezuela was due to an extraordinary increase in the price of primary goods. It was an external positive shock, which financed their governments for almost 10 years. When that favorable cycle came to an end in 2020, the price of raw materials was only 30% of the average value it had between 2003 and 2011. Latin American economies depend between 60 and 98% on commodity exports. Thus, the growth of these countries is not stable and depends on world market prices, and the most reasonable thing would be that when they have extraordinary income, they bet on economic diversification. That would indeed be revolutionary. In 2011, prices decreased due to the slowdown in Chinese growth, and the economies of the region suffered. This generated stagnation in the region and then a debacle, as happened to Venezuela in 2015, Brazil in 2016, Argentina in 2018, and Bolivia in 2019. To further complicate matters, the Venezuelan government spent the immense oil income it received, plus a good portion of the accumulated international reserves, and incurred increasing amounts of debt because it took advantage of the period of oil price boom to assume debt in impressive amounts, which Venezuelan society will hardly be able to pay, due to the collapse of the national economy. These current situation analyses must be incorporated to understand reality and know that politicians never show the true key factors of the outcome of their government and take advantage of the population by creating narratives that glorify them when favorable and looking for scapegoats when there is poor management, and phrases blaming the difficult context or the savage blockade or the pandemic, drought, and war arise. The Bolivarian Revolution received oil prices 3 times higher than normal in its 14 years in power, 1999 to 2013. Chávez received $1 trillion in oil revenues, which implies $30,000 for every Venezuelan man, woman, or child, enough to give each inhabitant more than $2,000 a year. But while a fraction of that money reached the population, the vast majority was consumed in corruption and bribes to the military structure, the true guarantor of the continuity of the Venezuelan regime.
María Gabriela Chávez, hija del fallecido presidente de Venezuela, Hugo Chávez, sería la persona más adinerada de su país. Informes periodísticos señalan que tendría una fortuna de más de $4.000 millones. El dinero estaría consignado en cuentas bancarias de Andorra y Estados Unidos. El Diario de las Américas asegura que la hija de Chávez superaría en capital incluso a los empresarios más acaudalados del país suramericano.
By the time Maduro took office, the value of oil did not allow him to have such surpluses, and besides, the productive structure of PDVSA went from being one of the most efficient in the world to having great internal corruption and being heavily indebted. To continue the regime, Maduro handed over the company to military hands in exchange for the support of the forces for whatever may come, becoming an increasingly repressive state. His civic military model is willing to do whatever it takes to stay in power.
Máxima unión y movilización cívico-militar, que el equipo gana y vamos a ganar. Por las buenas o por las malas, vamos a ganar, siempre a ganar.
The military is the key piece for sustaining Maduro's government structure, not only because of the power of weapons, but also because internal corruption already has its own distribution codes by hierarchies, and they manage the strategic sectors of the economy, being in charge of nothing less than the state oil company PDVSA, the distribution of food and medicine, as well as military personnel in key ministerial positions such as food and agriculture, from where the provision of food and fuel is ensured first for them and then for the population. The military are well aware that in no other democratic scenario could they have the possibilities of power, wealth, and authority they currently enjoy, so they play their part by repressively containing the population.
Poder militar, alerta!
y preparado para lo que salga, cuando salga y donde salga, para defender la patria, la Constitución y el pueblo. Cuando salga, donde salga y lo que salga. ¿Entendido? ¡Leales siempre!
The most thriving Venezuelan companies were expropriated, first by Chávez and then by Maduro, turning the government into the owner of a large number of businesses, industries, and fields. Since the state did not have the capacity or experience to manage businesses, companies, and fields, the project itself was a real failure, so most of the expropriated companies were not efficient, and when oil export revenues decreased, they could no longer sustain them with government contributions, and they were either closed or handed over to revolution militants who also did not know how to manage them, so most of them were looted and then abandoned. Low private economic activity, high costs in public employees and officials, and growing corruption ended up generating such a large economic deficit that it could no longer be contained with monetary issuance, and then they began to resort to borrowing from China, Iran, and Russia, and to finance themselves through the issuance of bonds, both through the state and the state oil company PDVSA. The Bolivarian Revolution is not only annihilating Venezuela, but also mortgaging its future. The Venezuelan state has not published official figures on its debt in the last 5 years. There are no official reports, or they are very opaque. The most prudent estimates calculate that the country's external debt is $120 billion, but experts believe it could approach $200 billion, a much worse situation than before the Caracazo of 1989, which was precisely the argument for which Chávez staged a coup against then-President Carlos Andrés Pérez, who had $6.5 billion in external debt. Venezuela, the most indebted country in Latin America and the Caribbean, defaulted in 2017. Over the course of these 6 years, and after experiencing until 2023 the worst hyperinflation in the region's history, the country remains today as one of the most inflationary economies in the world. At the same time, Venezuelan society continues to be immersed in a complex humanitarian emergency that has forced a migratory flow that already exceeds 7.3 million migrants, according to R4V platform data. In this context, there is no doubt that Venezuela is heading towards the abyss, and the main responsibility lies with Nicolás Maduro. This report does not intend to make an evaluation of the ideological aspect, but on the contrary to see the real results in quality of life for Venezuelans, respecting the sovereign decisions that its population may make, and in any case we limit ourselves to show their results and analyze their perspectives so that they are useful for comparing them with other forms of government and seeking the best for Latin America. Your contributions and opinions as a Latin American interest us. We read you in the comments.